Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Natasha Feroz, the Spectator's Deputy Broadcast Editor, and today I'm joined by Jake Wallace-Simons, a journalist at the Jewish Chronicle and The Telegraph, and urban war expert John Spencer. Jake, you are in Israel at the moment, and hundreds of thousands of people have been taken to the streets protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu's refusal to commit towards a ceasefire. What is the atmosphere like in Israel at the moment?
Well, it's really very febrile. We had the deaths of those 6 hostages, their cold-blooded execution, I should say, by Hamas under the ground just a few days ago. And that was followed by really heartrending scenes at their funerals the next day, including at least one American citizen, Hirsch, who'd become a sort of icon, like a face of the hostage movement, if you like, on account of the wonderful campaigning by his parents. And the country was really grieving because I think it had been allowed to hope that they would come back as part of a deal, and their executions really hit people hard over here. And it was followed immediately by people taking to the streets in protest against Prime Minister Netanyahu, blaming him for not getting those people back by refusing to commit to a deal because he's holding out against the idea of Israel withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor, which is that narrow strip of land along the border between Egypt and Gaza, where hundreds of smuggling tunnels go, and that's where the arms, cash, and personnel are brought into the Gaza Strip from Egypt. It's its lifeline, if you like. So Netanyahu's argument is that allowing the IDF to leave that will allow Hamas to regroup, rearm, and do October the 7th again, whereas a lot of other people in Israel feel that it's more important right now to get those hostages back.
It does look like the majority of Israelis do prioritise getting the hostages back. I think it's 53% of the public want the hostages to be prioritised. Over 29% prioritise the Philadelphia corridor. Is that the sense you're getting in Israel at the moment? Obviously, there are hundreds of thousands of protesters taking to the streets, but are they the ones just with the loudest voice?
I think that really it's the debate itself is quite a difficult and certainly a very anguished one. How do you save the most lives? Everyone wants the hostages back. Everyone wants another October the 7th to be prevented. But the question is of judgment, whether it's better to give up the Philadelphia corridor for the hostages or the reverse. But it's become so heavily politicized, and the debate has become so overheated, with politicians slagging each other off, accusing each other of being sympathizers with Hamas, or standing in the way of, or killing hostages, that sort of thing. That everyone it's become a proxy for a very, very unpleasant political atmosphere which has been building in Israel over the last year or more since Netanyahu took power on the basis of that coalition, which includes far-right members. So really, the atmosphere here is very tense and very unpleasant. And I would just add that the polls show that 70% of Israelis don't trust Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's a difficult and very tragic position for him to be in, because even if he's making genuine arguments about the Philadelphia corridor from a security point of view, the public aren't trusting that he's making it for the right reasons. So the whole thing really is wrapped up in a lot of political dysfunctionality, which is adding a lot of heat and not very much light to what is a very, very serious, even existential debate.
John, you are a urban war expert and have spent some time in Gaza since this war broke out. Could you just talk a little bit about what that front line along the corridor looks like at the moment, and what it must be like for IDF soldiers attacking Hamas under the tunnels? What sort of weapons are they expected to use? How do they control that border?
Sure. On the border area is, of course, an unknown number. They found over 100 of bloodlines, basically. The sole thing that is allowing Hamas to continue to believe that it has a chance to win the war, that it will get the resupplies of weapons to basically arm even new Hamas members, as the IDF have been very effective at destroying Hamas's military. From an individual aspect and what I saw in my visits into Gaza, urban warfare is the hardest for any military, but no military has faced what the IDF have faced, is where every step you take, there is most likely a tunnel underneath you that Hamas is using, and to include what they're doing to the hostages that are in their possession, basically. Some of the pictures and videos of even the ones they brutally murdered recently, the starvation and the treatment of the prisoners being held in these tunnels where you can't, it's just not healthy for anybody to be in these tunnels, and what it does to the psychology and physical health of anybody who stays in those awful tunnels. But for the soldiers, they're also having to fight this combatant that doesn't care about their population, unlike really any combatant that I've studied in past, not the Nazis, not the Japanese, a combatant who is doing everything they can to get their own population killed for their strategy to win the war, which is just to survive. But the IDF are also fighting this in the context that, which is an Israeli standard, that they need to fight Hamas, but with zero civilian casualties, while Hamas is trying to get as many casualties as killed as possible. But we have this problem in especially the Western world where we impose our values on other people like Hamas when they don't hold our values.
Jake, do you think that Netanyahu's on his own with this red line being along the Philadelphia corridor, or is he under pressure from his coalition?
Well, certainly the far-right members of his coalition, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, are very keen that the IDF does not withdraw at all from Gaza. They are in favour of the place being reoccupied, but they represent a very small fragment of a fringe of Israeli society. The vast majority does not want to see that outcome, including the Prime Minister himself, I believe. He's under some pressure from them, of course, but then there are also, as John said, some very compelling security arguments to not pulling out of the Philadelphia corridor. I think that the last 17 or so years since Hamas seized power in Gaza have been characterized by some complacency and naivety on the behalf of the Israeli government in thinking that if you can just allow enough stability into Gaza, allowing money in, allowing 17,000 Gazans to work in Israel each day to support the economy, and maintain a containment strategy of military superiority, then sooner or later the people inside Gaza won't want to fight you, and eventually some sort of transformation will take place. Well, October the 7th showed that was profoundly naive. That concept, as they call it, hakonceptia, was profoundly naive and was mistaken, and people underestimated the depths of the depravity of Hamas and their willingness to sacrifice, as John said, their own citizens and their own territory, all in the name of some kind of jihadi ideal, which is just contemptible and depraved. And so right now, there's a big concern in certain quarters that pulling out of the Philadelphia corridor would once again be back to that habit of underestimating Hamas, thinking it will be fine when it might very well not be. And there's a lot, as we saw on October the 7th, there is a lot at stake here.
How are the Egyptians reacting to this part of the negotiations? Are they involved in the discussions, and who do they want to see in control of that border?
Well, the Egyptians would be involved if the Israelis were to pull out of Philadelphia corridor, certainly, because they would be called upon to take on the security of ensuring that weapons and cash and personnel are no longer smuggled into Gaza and those tunnels don't reappear. Of course, the Egyptians have been in charge nominally of security for the past 17 years, ever since Israel pulled out of the Philadelphia corridor the first time around. In fact, the history of the Philadelphia corridor was that it was initially placed under Israeli control, but Israel felt that it was indefensible because it's so narrow and therefore pulled out, leaving the security to Egypt. But given the endemic corruption in the Egyptian military, backhanders were very effective, and before long, Hamas were able to drill these more than 100 tunnels into Egypt, and the rest, as they say, is history. So Egypt would need to play a security role if Israel were to withdraw. But I think on the whole, Egypt has really been reluctant to get involved with this at all. Don't forget, Egypt had its own problem with the Hamas insurgency during the Arab Spring, which was very unpleasant for them. Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood are two sides of the same coin. So Egypt has no love for Hamas. Egypt has refused to open its border to allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza, all the blame's been going towards Israel. Egypt has got none of the blame, but a lot of the responsibility internationally. It's failed to live up to any of its international humanitarian responsibilities towards the people of Gaza, but nobody says a word. And Egypt, of course, resisted the Israeli invasion of Rafah tooth and nail. It even tried to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court with South Africa to support that case, even though Egypt's human rights record is abysmal, because it was trying everything it could to stop the world from finding out how complicit Egypt has been in the build-up of Hamas's forces in Gaza. So Egypt has this uneasy peace with Israel, has got a very checkered past with regard to Hamas, but overall, it's just saying, leave us out of it.
But that must put massive pressure on Egypt's relationship with Iran, no?
Yeah, I mean the Egyptian-Iranian relationship is not a close one. Iran is part of a radical Shia axis, which has proxies in Lebanon, of course, with Hezbollah, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere. Egypt, on the other hand, is a conservative Sunni power, which really is on the other side of the fence to the Iranians. And Egypt, of course, does have a peace deal with Israel, and they do have a security relationship, which is very, very valuable indeed to both countries. So I would say that Egypt and Iran have an oppositional dynamic, not any kind of alliance.
I'd like to ask both of you about Professor John Mearsheimer, who's someone we've had on our Spectator TV show several times. We met him in Chicago just a couple of weeks ago. And I suppose a foreign policy realist perspective is that perhaps there's another strategy involved in Netanyahu's plan. Perhaps this is more about Netanyahu wanting to keep hold of his reign on Israel and not wanting to concede power. John, what did you make of that? And Jake, maybe you answer after John.
Sure. So, I think it's just not based on the facts of the war. Netanyahu is not a dictator. It is a democracy with a cabinet, with a nation to secure. And the ideal that Israel, again, these are the misconceptions that Israel has been the hurdle to a temporary ceasefire to return the hostages. It's just not true. Israel has actually agreed to all the bridging strategies proposed by the United States, but won't sacrifice the security of Israel, which no nation would be required to, in order to allow Hamas to conduct October 7th and then survive. Israel has a national security concern to remove or demilitarize Gaza and remove Hamas from power and never letting them have power again. But the idea that Israel or Netanyahu himself is the biggest hurdle to a temporary ceasefire that would bring hostages home is just not true.
Jake?
I agree with John. I think that in Netanyahu's mind, so far as anyone can ascertain, there's obviously going to be a mixture of political motivations and his own personal gain, but also national security motivations and what's good for the country. And with any politician, that's always going to be mixed up. And like I said, Israel is so divided at the moment, and the arguments are so febrile. The left are accusing Netanyahu of scuppering a deal because with the hostage deal, the far-right members of his coalition have threatened to bring down the government by resigning and toppling him from power. But at the same time, it could equally be argued that the left are trying to push for a deal because that would also cause Netanyahu to have problems with his coalition and topple him from power. So if you want to be cynical, you've got to be cynical really across the board, or then Netanyahu has his reputation for being particularly venal. I don't think he's he's a politician, and there are politicians on both sides of this argument. Ultimately, like John, I believe that it's a bit of a stretch to think that any Western leader will place the lives of their citizens secondary to their own political career. It's a big accusation that makes that really does paint a hugely debased image of Netanyahu. He's a politician. He's got his faults, like many people do. But personally, I think that's going a bit far.
John, I want to ask you about a decision taken this week in Britain where our new Foreign Secretary David Lammy has put an embargo on some of our arms exports to Israel. It was quite a controversial decision, especially to come immediately after the announcement that 6 of the hostages were murdered by Hamas. What was your reaction to this? And could you talk a little bit about how much Israel relies on UK arms, what sort of weapons they are that they rely on? Because to me, it just seems like it's surely a fraction of what America sends to Israel in the first place.
Yeah, I was very unhappy to see that decision, mainly because I know it's based on really a lot of misinformation about the way that Israel has executed the war and what it's done to protect the civilians in Gaza in the back. But it is a small fraction of what Israel, basically Defense Department needs. But it is a terrible signal to send to all of the world, that the British government is going to make decisions based on not fact, but misinformation, on inferences and assumptions, and the use of Hamas casualty numbers. It's very problematic, not necessarily from a real terms of Israel's defense, but in signal to the world that you have a democratic government, a part of the Western world, making a decision based on totally baseless and problematic for the security of Britain, for the UK's military and its future wars, that the law of war has no meaning. It's just the law of public opinion, which would be really problematic for everybody. So it's really unfortunate to see.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Israel is good at fighting wars. Hamas is good at propaganda. And, there's no greater authority in the world in urban warfare than John. And he's attested that Israel is doing more to protect civilian life, having seen it on the ground, than any other country in the history of warfare. But you wouldn't know it from our TV screens, because that's basically controlled by Hamas, in that they censor all the footage that comes out of Gaza. Anybody listening to this, I would suggest that you ask yourself, when's the last time you watched the nightly news on television and saw a single image of a dead or wounded Hamas fighter? The answer will be never. Why is that? Because Hamas prevent you from seeing it, because they censor that footage, giving the world the impression that Israel is waging war against civilians, and not one single international broadcaster makes that clear to its audience. It's absolutely reprehensible. Hamas is manipulating the media, and unfortunately, that manipulates public opinion, which then puts political pressure on governments. Now, Britain sells to Israel only 1% of Israel's arms imports. The UK government is now suspending 10% of the 1%. So it's negligible. It makes no difference at all to Israel's ability to defend itself. But it invites attention to the other countries to whom the UK government sells arms. Qatar is sold more than £3 billion of arms over the last 3 years. Qatar, the foremost sponsor of Sunni terrorism in the world. The Saudis have been sold 1.9 billion, regardless of their bloody war in Yemen. Turkey has been sold almost £800 million, regardless of their massacre of the Kurds. The police and corrupt state of Egypt has been sold £318 million of arms. Israel, the Middle East's only democracy that's battling for its life while trying to protect civilians against the same jihadi foes that would kill us and have done in the past, has purchased £83 million. So it's negligible, it's wrong-headed, and it's totally hypocritical to sell arms to those autocracies while moving to deny it from the Middle East's only democracy. I beg your pardon.
Would you think it's just purely tokenistic? Do you think it's an attempt to pander to what is a real problem for Labour, which is the Muslim vote?
Well, I think David Lammy obviously has these two constituencies to cater for, to look after. One is the Jewish constituency, Jewish voters, who were very abandoned during the Corbyn years. In fact, abandoned Labour during the Corbyn years because the party became institutionally anti-Semitic. So Labour's tried hard to win those voters back. At the same time, it hemorrhaged Muslim voters to pro-Gaza independents at the general election, and is very worried about losing their support further. I think that worry is overblown, because Labour has such a big majority, it doesn't need to cater to minority communities in that way. But it does seem as if it's influencing its foreign policy decision-making to some extent with this latest decision. I can only hope that David Lammy and Keir Starmer and the rest of the government begin to heed experts like John and begin to look at the facts which show that Israel is protecting civilian life in the way that no other country and no other military has done in similar circumstances in the past, and make foreign policy based on those facts, rather than the Hamas propaganda that swamps our airwaves and whips up certain segments of our society into a frenzy. And it's my hope that David Lammy will eventually revise this decision, and that wiser heads will prevail.
And John, we're just 2 months away from the American general election. How much do you think this Israel-Gaza war is going to be a massive feature when it comes to the voters in the polling stations?
I think it will be a significant one. I mean, there's no shortage of domestic issues that will be, but I think that in the region, in the world, that everybody's waiting to November, and that's unfortunate for many of our allies that that's the case. But it is the reality. Absolutely, it will definitely play a role, and it seems to have already in the campaigns of both parties and both candidates, because it's a important issue. If people don't understand in the United States or anywhere else that what is happening there is Iran's ideal for redesigning the entire Middle East, if not world, and that allowing this to continue, this belief that the Hamas can do an operation, Hezbollah's attacks, Iran's attacks, you're basically upsetting the entire order of the region. And hopefully voters and both voters and politicians understand the gravity of that as much as they do Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and lastly, I just have one final question for both of you. It's just something that I'm always puzzled by when we talk about this issue of eradicating Hamas. What does success in eradicating Hamas look like? I mean, it's very hard to pinpoint what a Hamas soldier looks like. It could be a young child with a gun. It could be someone who's been in their army for a very long time. So when Netanyahu talks about his key policy, removing Hamas from Gaza, how will he know when that's been achieved?
Sure. I mean, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs recently to explain that. That is, Israel is winning in Gaza despite the misinformation, but it's on Israel whether they win. The clear definition of winning is Hamas is no longer has political or military power in Gaza ever again, or the capability to attack Israel ever again. That requires demilitarizing Gaza, but also finding a new power that will be the new governing authority in Gaza, in which Israel will have to continue to support through a security framework that prevents Hamas, who are going to try. This is the whole idea that you can't defeat an ideology. Well, I can absolutely defeat a government and a military and take away their ability to conduct operations. And then you work on de-radicalization programs amongst all post-conflict operations. It's not new to the world, but people have a wrong framework in viewing what Hamas was. Hamas was the government of a territory with a vast military capability. After you defeat them and you take their means away, then you implement new de-radicalization, new governance policies, so that you actually do free Gaza from Hamas and the Palestinian people lead a better life.
But would that consist of Palestine being an entirely demilitarized zone so they can't defend themselves either?
It means that there is no longer a government that, for the sole purpose of existing, is the destruction of Israel and the death of all Jews. Yes. So does it mean that they don't have a policing force and all of this? No. So there's a stretch.
Jake, are you the same, or do you have a different point of view?
I tend to think that this question that's become so commonplace of, how can Hamas be destroyed? It's an idea. You can never destroy the enemy. I feel that it is a talking point that originated in sympathy for Hamas. I mean, it's quite obvious how you defeat an enemy. Think back to World War II, how we defeated Nazis. And nobody said, you can't defeat Nazism. It's an ideology, therefore let's not try. People fought the Nazis militarily, defeated them comprehensively, and then embarked on a program of denazification of society and installed or enabled to grow a proper, healthy democracy, which is flourishing to this day. It's quite obvious the same thing needs to apply in a different context, a more complex context in some ways, in Gaza. Hamas has got to be destroyed and dismantled militarily so it can never function to threaten Israel with the force of arms again. Then the population has got to be de-radicalized through a program of education, and some kind of stable replacement government, which is as close to a democracy as possible, has got to be found and formulated and encouraged to flourish and supported. Now, that's not easy. I'm not saying that's easy for one moment, but there really is no alternative. The alternative is what? don't fight Hamas because you think they can't be destroyed because they're an idea. That makes absolutely no sense. It only invites another October the 7th. And I would just make this point to conclude that if everybody wants a two-state solution, that will never happen with Hamas in power in any way, shape, or form. Hamas do not believe in a two-state solution. Hamas believes in the killing of all the Jews in the Middle East and beyond. They have a fanatical jihadist ideology. They will stand in the way of a two-state solution. They only want death, war, destruction, and victory for this fanatical ideology. When Hamas are there, ain't going to have any peace. If you want a two-state solution or any kind of peaceful solution, Hamas going has got to be the first step.
Jake Wallace-Simons and John Spencer, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.